She was hunted, hiding, and scarred. She had nothing but a scar until a quiet farmer gave her. The last light of day slanted across the Vermont hills, casting a golden hue over rows of apple trees heavy with fruit. Caleb Foster had just finished inspecting the irrigation lines when he heard it, a faint rustling near the edge of the orchard where the forest pressed close against his land. At first, he thought it was a deer. Then he heard something else, a sharp breath, like someone in pain. He followed the sound quietly, boots crunching over fallen leaves and soft earth. There, curled beneath one of the older apple trees, was a woman. Her jacket was torn, her jeans stained with blood and dirt. She had a long gash on her arm and a bruise swelling along her jaw. Her face was turned away, partly hidden by tangled hair, but what caught Caleb's attention was her posture. Not just pain, but fear, raw and alert, like a cornered animal. "Hey," he said softly, not moving closer. "You okay?" She flinched, tried to sit up, but cried out instead. Her left ankle looked twisted, and the blood on her shirt told him this wasn't just a sprained leg. Caleb raised his hands in peace. "I live just over that hill," he said, gesturing with a nod. "Name's Caleb. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, only gripped her side tighter and looked toward the darkening woods behind her, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge. "Please," she rasped, "don't tell anyone I'm here. If they find me—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Caleb hesitated for just a second. Then he unzipped his flannel overshirt and draped it over her shoulders. "You need help. You're not going to make it through the night like this." "I'll be fine," she said, but the words were hollow. "Maybe," he replied, "but I'm not." She looked at him, puzzled. "If something happens to you on my land, I'll never sleep again." It wasn't a threat, just simple, quiet truth. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. He helped her up, gently as he could. She winced, but didn't cry out. Caleb supported most of her weight as they made their way through the rows of trees, lit now by the orange afterglow of sunset. By the time they reached the small cabin behind his main house, she was trembling from cold and pain. He opened the door, led her inside, and said just one thing before leaving her alone with the warm light and silence. "You don't have to tell me anything, just rest." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the woman with no name closed her eyes somewhere she didn't feel hunted. The small cabin behind Caleb's house had once been his grandfather's workshop. Now it was mostly used for storing tools and drying herbs from the garden. But tonight it became something else, a sanctuary. He stoked the cast-iron stove until the cabin filled with the scent of pine and smoke. Then he fetched a first aid kit from the main house, filled a kettle, and boiled water. By the time he returned, the woman was sitting on the edge of the old cot in the corner, his flannel shirt still draped over her, hands clenched tightly in her lap. "You're shivering," he said gently, kneeling in front of her with the kit. "I'm fine," she replied, though her lips were pale and her fingers trembled. Caleb didn't argue. Instead, he soaked a clean cloth in warm water and began to gently wipe the blood from her arm. She winced once but didn't pull away. Up close, he saw the wound more clearly. Deep, jagged, likely from something metal. A branch wouldn't have done this. He said nothing. Not about the blood, not about the bruises, not about the scar he glimpsed along her collarbone as the shirt shifted. Instead, he cleaned the gash, applied antibiotic cream, and wrapped it tightly with gauze. "You'll need rest," he said quietly. "And food." She said nothing at first. Then, "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged slightly. "Because you're here. Because someone should." She looked at him then, really looked, her dark eyes searching his face like she was trying to find the catch, the hidden price he hadn't named. But there was nothing there except calm, patient kindness. The kind that didn't demand explanations. "I don't have a name," she said finally. "Kamars." He smiled faintly. "That's okay. I'm Caleb." She hesitated. "You can call me Ray." It sounded made up, but he nodded. "All right, Ray." After she drank a mug of warm tea, she drifted into sleep, curled beneath the wool blanket like a child trying to disappear. Caleb sat by the fire a while longer, listening to the soft wind outside and the crackle of flame. He didn't know what Ray had fled from, didn't know how she ended up bleeding in his orchard, or why shadows flickered in her eyes every time a branch tapped the window. But what he did know, down to the marrow of his bones, was this: you don't turn away from someone just because they come to you broken. And tomorrow, when the questions came, he'd wait for her to be ready to answer. The fog rolled in just after dawn, shbol, thick and silver. It settled low over the orchard like a secret. Ray sat by the window of the cabin, the wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, watching the mist coil around the apple trees like ghostly fingers. She hadn't slept much. Every creak of the wood, every shift in the wind made her heart thump against her ribs like a warning drum. Outside, Caleb moved through the trees with the ease of a man who belonged to the land. He checked the fence posts, fed the chickens, and carried a crate of apples into the main house. If he noticed Ray watching, he didn't say anything. He just tipped his hat slightly when he passed the window. She had begun to believe, almost, that maybe she'd be safe here for a little while longer. Then came the sound. Not loud, not sudden, but unmistakable. Chebisse Consuel, tires crunching gravel at the edge of the road. Chebisse, Ray's breath caught. She turned sharply, peering through the fog, heart hammering. A dark vehicle loomed just beyond the orchard's fence line. Then another. Black SUVs, too clean for country roads, too slow to be casual. She stood quickly and limped toward the door, flinging it open just as Caleb appeared from behind the henhouse, a crate in hand. He saw her face and immediately set the crate down. "Ray?" he asked, voice low. "They found me," she whispered. "I don't know how, but they did." Caleb didn't ask who they were. He didn't press for answers. He simply nodded once, turned, and walked to the porch of the main house, where a steaming mug of coffee still sat untouched. The vehicles pulled in slowly, deliberately. 3 men stepped out. Suits under weathered jackets, eyes that didn't blink. One of them carried a photo, her photo. "Morning," Caleb said from the porch, lifting the mug to his lips. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "We're looking for someone," said the man in the lead, flashing a badge that looked too vague to be real. "Woman, late 20s, brown hair, maybe injured. You seen anyone pass through here?" Caleb squinted at them, unimpressed. "Only thing passed through my land this morning is fog and chicken feed." "She's dangerous," the man said. "Fugitive. Has information she stole from a government contract. If you're hiding her, that makes you complicit." Caleb set the mug down on the railing. "You got a warrant?" The man smiled thinly. "Not yet." "Then I guess you'll be getting off my land." The two locked eyes. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. In the cabin, Ray stood just behind the curtain, her breath shallow, her hand trembling as she held the old hunting knife Caleb had left on the nightstand the night before, just in case. The men finally backed off. "If she comes by, you let us know," the agent said. "I'll holler real loud," Caleb replied, stone-faced. The SUVs reversed down the gravel road and disappeared into the fog. Caleb didn't turn around until he was sure they were gone. Back in the cabin, Ray sat on the edge of the cot, hands shaking. When he stepped inside, she looked up at him, eyes wide. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They'll come back. They'll come harder." He took the knife from her hand and set it gently on the table. "I don't care who they are," he said quietly. "You needed help. That's all that matters to me." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But in that moment, something shifted inside her, like a locked door opening a crack. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was beginning to trust. The days that followed moved slowly, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of the orchard. Ray stayed in the cabin, but not always indoors. Sometimes she'd limp along the fence line in the early morning light, pausing to run her hand over the old wooden posts. She helped sort apples on the back porch, and watched Caleb prune the trees with deliberate, careful movements. She spoke little. But she listened. And Caleb, to his credit, didn't press her with questions. He talked about the weather, about how the orchard used to belong to his grandfather, about the squirrels who kept stealing apples from the south trees, things that didn't matter on paper, but to her, they felt like a kind of offering. A bridge. She was healing, though slowly. The wound on her side scabbed and faded to an angry red mark. The bruises yellowed and disappeared, but the scar across her lower arm remained vivid, a reminder of something she never explained. She still hadn't told him her real name. One afternoon, Caleb brought in a basket of pears from a neighboring grove. Ray was in the kitchen, rolling out dough for a pie, something she'd said she remembered doing as a child. Her sleeves were pushed up, revealing lean forearms, steady hands, and a scar near her wrist that looked older than the rest. "Smells good," Caleb said, placing the basket down. "Don't thank me yet," Ray murmured. "I haven't baked in years." "I'll take my chances." She glanced at him, then away, wiping flour on her jeans. "Why don't you ever ask?" "Ask what?" "Who I really am, where I came from." Caleb leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. "Because I figure you'll tell me when you're ready. And if you never are, that's your choice." Ray turned back to the dough, her expression unreadable. "It's not that I don't want to tell you. It's just, once I say it out loud, it becomes real again." He nodded, understanding more than he let on. Sometimes pretending is the only way to breathe. She met his eyes then, sharp, searching. "You ever hide from your own name?" "No," he said after a pause. "But I've hidden from what it meant." A silence settled between them, soft as the dust on the windowsill. Then she said it, not her real name, not yet, but something close. "I used to be someone," she whispered. "Someone with titles, papers, a name that got me through doors. Now I'm just Ray." Caleb stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "You're still someone, even if no one knows your name." She looked down at her hands, flexed her fingers against the floured surface. "I wish I believed that," she said. "You will," he replied. Eventually. That night she stood outside under a sky full of stars, the scent of baked apples still lingering in the air. She watched the trees sway gently in the wind, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a ghost walking through someone else's life. She didn't say it aloud, but in her mind, she whispered it. "My name isn't Ray." But for now, that's who she needed to be, and for the first time, it felt almost safe. The wind came in late that night, soft at first, then stronger, rattling the shutters on the cabin and sending leaves skittering across the orchard like whispers. Ray lay awake on the cot, her eyes tracing the wooden beams above her, hands clenched in the blanket. Sleep had nearly come when she heard it. Again, the low moan of the wind through the trees, but this time, it wasn't the sound that made her heart race. It was the memory it brought with it. The last time she'd heard wind like this, it had been through the broken window of a burning summer house. Her brother's voice still echoed in her ears. "Take the deal. Disappear, or next time you won't wake up." She sat up, clutching the locket she kept tucked under her pillow. A small silver oval with worn edges, its clasp nearly broken. She hadn't opened it in weeks, not since the night she crawled out of that ravine. Not since she became Ray. Outside, the wind hissed again, and she slipped on her boots. She found Caleb in the barn, brushing down his old bay mare. He turned as she entered, surprised, but not startled. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked gently. She nodded, stepping past the stalls. "The wind. It reminds me." He didn't press her, just waited, combing his fingers through the horse's mane. "I lied," she said suddenly. "Or maybe just left out too much." Caleb paused, then hung the brush on the wall. "I figured," he said quietly. "Didn't seem like someone who just stumbled through town by accident." She took a deep breath, bracing herself. "My real name is Elena Hawthorne." His brow rose slightly, but he didn't speak. "You've probably heard it. My family owns Hawthorne Minerals. Oil. Timber. Real estate. My father passed a few years ago, left the company to my brother and me. I found out he was funneling funds, selling off conservation lands, using private security to keep it buried. When I tried to expose it, she trailed off, her eyes glassy." Caleb stepped closer but didn't interrupt. "I was drugged. My car was rigged. They made it look like I died in a fire. The scar on my arm, that's from crawling through glass. I've been running ever since." Caleb leaned against the stall post, his voice calm. "And the files? The truth you tried to carry? They're in a flash drive, hidden inside the locket. He nodded, as if it all made perfect sense now. I thought I could stay dead, Elena whispered, but I don't want to disappear anymore. The wind howled once more, flapping the barn doors. You don't have to, Caleb said. Not here. She looked up at him, eyes fierce and wounded. They'll come if they know I'm alive. Then we make sure they regret it. She laughed, a quiet, breathless sound equal parts fear and relief. You're not afraid? Of them? He asked, stepping forward. Not really. And of me? Caleb met her gaze, steady and kind. Only afraid I'll wake up tomorrow and find you gone. The silence that followed was soft, like snow falling between them. Elena looked down at her hands, then back at him. I don't want to run anymore. He held out his hand, palm up, then stay. And for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She placed the locket in his hand, not as a burden but as a promise. The next morning, Caleb found himself turning the silver locket over in his hand as sunlight poured across the kitchen table. It was heavier than it looked, like it carried more than metal. Elena sat across from him, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee, hair damp from the sink and eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. I never meant to bring this to your doorstep, she said quietly, voice rough from fatigue. Caleb didn't answer right away. He opened the locket, careful with the old hinge. Inside, where a photo would usually be, was a tiny flash drive nestled behind a false back. Cleverly disguised, but now exposed. Don't apologize, he said simply. You didn't bring trouble. Trouble brought itself. She gave a bitter smile. That's one way to put it. He looked at her, not at the scars or the exhaustion, but at the way her shoulders squared despite everything. You've been surviving. That's more than most would have managed. She met his eyes. I don't want to just survive anymore. Outside, the wind had calmed. The orchard was quiet again, the trees swaying gently in the morning light. It was hard to believe danger could ever find its way into such peace. But she knew better. Peace was fragile. It had to be fought for. I have everything I need to expose them, she said, tapping the table lightly. Financial records, land deeds, audio clips from board meetings. Even a few names in government who helped bury the truth, Caleb whistled low. That's not just proof, that's dynamite, she nodded. The kind that makes people disappear if it gets into the wrong hands. He leaned forward. So let's get it to the right ones. Elena blinked, startled. You'd help me? You're here, aren't you? He said. This orchard doesn't just grow fruit, it grows second chances. She looked away, blinking quickly. You make it sound easy. It won't be, but nothing worth keeping ever is. Later that afternoon, they spread out the contents of a locked box she'd hidden in the root cellar, a stack of documents, flash drives, and 2 battered notebooks with handwritten entries and timelines. Caleb didn't understand all the numbers, but he saw the weight of it. Corruption, bribery, threats, and blood. While she explained, he watched her, not the details she shared, but the way her hands shook when she turned certain pages, or how her voice faltered when mentioning her brother's name. There was grief beneath the anger, a wound that ran deeper than any physical scar. You still loved him, Caleb said gently. She nodded. I wanted to believe he'd stop before it went too far, that he'd remember who we used to be. She stared at the papers, the weight of years pressing down. I wasn't just running from them, she whispered. I was running from the fact that I didn't stop him sooner. Caleb reached out and placed his hand over hers. You're not running anymore, he said. You're standing. She exhaled, the sound more like a release than a breath, and when she looked at him, there was something new in her expression. Still afraid, still uncertain, but no longer alone. That night, she moved her things from the cabin to the main house, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Kamai he still ansai ha. And when Caleb handed her a set of spare keys, she didn't flinch. She took them and stayed. It happened just after midnight. The orchard slept beneath a full moon, silver light slipping through the leaves like whispers. Caleb was still awake, sorting through scanned copies of the files Elena had gathered. She had gone to bed hours earlier, exhausted from recounting names and dates and betrayals. The kettle on the stove had just begun to hiss when the smell hit him. Mahler smoke. Mahler dod, not the kind from hearthwood or autumn leaves. This was sharp, chemical. Wrong. He was already moving before the teacup hit the counter. Outside, the wind had picked up. Too suddenly, it carried with it a glow. Orange, flickering, alive. The barn was burning. Flames clawed at the wooden siding, already devouring the hayloft. Sparks leapt skyward like fireflies gone mad. The horses inside screamed in panic, hooves pounding. Caleb didn't think, he ran. "Elena!" he shouted as he passed the porch. "Wake up!" She was already at the door, barefoot, eyes wide. "What?" "They're here," he barked, grabbing the shotgun from the porch hook. "Get out the back! To the creek!" "But now!" His voice cracked like thunder. "Go!" Even as she ran, she saw the shapes in the dark. Men, at least 3, weaving through the orchard, their shadows long and silent. One fired. The shot hit the dirt near Caleb's boots. He didn't flinch. Fired back. Not to kill, just to scatter. The lead. A second figure lunged from behind the well, tackling him hard. They hit the ground with a thud that sent dust flying. Caleb fought back, wild and instinctive. Fists. Elbows. He landed one punch before a hard object, something cold and metal, crashed against the side of his skull. The world spun. Then darkness. Elena heard it all as she crouched behind a cluster of crates near the creek. Gunshots, shouting, and then silence. She waited. Breath held. Hands trembling. And when the attackers retreated, their mission unfinished, she crept back toward the smoking ruin of the barn. She found Caleb in the dirt, unconscious, blood streaking the side of his face. "No, no, no," she whispered, kneeling beside him. Her training, half remembered from a youth spent in private schools and survival retreats, kicked in. She checked his pulse. Still beating. She tore strips from her shirt to staunch the bleeding, then half carried, half dragged him toward the hidden cellar beneath the old feed room. There, in the dark, she lit a lantern and stitched what she could, her fingers shaking so badly the needle slipped twice. Dags! She didn't sleep. Not that night. Not for the next 2. Dags! She boiled herbs for the swelling, used ice from the creek to cool his fever, sat beside him, whispering his name like it was the only thing keeping the walls from caving in. On the 3rd morning, when the rain came gently tapping against the tin roof, Caleb stirred. He groaned, blinked, turned his head, and saw her. "Elena," he rasped. Tears welled in her eyes. She gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You're alive," she whispered. A sob caught in her throat. "You stayed, even when you shouldn't have." His lips curled faintly. "Told you, orchard grows second chances." And in that dim cellar, surrounded by the scent of smoke and damp earth, something broke open inside her. She leaned in, pressed her forehead to his, and whispered, "You never saw me as a threat, or a target, or a scar. You saw me." He squeezed her fingers, weakly, but enough. That was all she needed. The fire had tried to take everything, but it failed, because what burned that night wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the spark of a reckoning. By the time Caleb could stand again without groaning, the barn was little more than charred timber and collapsed beams. The orchard, miraculously, had survived, though the leaves near the fire's edge were still tinged black at the tips. Elena had done what she could, replaced fencing, tended to the spooked horses that had bolted into the hills, and kept the cellar stocked with food, medicine, and the files that now felt like dynamite in her hands. They didn't talk much those first few days. Caleb was healing. Elena was watching the tree lines, the gravel road, the sky, watching herself too. measuring the fear against the fire rising in her chest. The fear was still there, but it no longer led. On the fifth evening, as the sky bruised purple and the air filled with the scent of scorched wood and rain-soaked soil, Caleb stepped out onto the porch with her and said, "Tell me everything." So she did. She told him about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, the conservation lands that were supposed to be protected but had quietly been sold to drilling firms, about the names, politicians, regulators, even a judge or two. She told him about her brother, Vincent Hawthorne, charismatic, ruthless, the darling of business magazines who had built his empire on charm and silence, the one who had smiled the morning he offered her a deal and tried to bury her that same night. Hartfelt. I didn't want to believe it, she said, staring out at the orchard. But he looked me in the eye and said, "You're either on the inside or under the ground." Caleb didn't speak, just stood beside her, steady and unmoved. I crawled through the wreckage, she continued, clutching a flash drive wrapped in plastic like it was a life raft. I didn't even know where I was going. Just away. "You came here," he said softly. "I didn't mean to," she admitted. But something about the trees, the quiet, it felt like a place where I could stop being prey. Caleb looked out at the land, the rolling orchard, the hills beyond, the ashes where the barn once stood. "It is that kind of place, if you make it so." She turned to him. "But it's yours. I brought this here." "No," he said. "You brought yourself here. That's different." A long silence passed between them, but it wasn't heavy. Then Elena said what had been lodged in her throat for days. "I want to fight back." Caleb nodded. "Then we will." She looked at him, searching his face for doubt. There was none. "I need help," she said. "People I can trust. Places to send what I've got. Lawyers, journalists, people who can't be bought." "I know a few," he replied. "Not many, but enough." They spent that night at the kitchen table, lit by an old lantern and the faint orange glow of the hearth. Documents were sorted, timelines built, drop points established, flash drives copied. Caleb didn't understand all the legalese, but he understood the stakes. And in between pages, they shared stories about his grandfather who built this orchard with little more than grit and rainwater, and about her mother, who used to read Elena poetry while braiding her hair. It was the first time Elena smiled without looking over her shoulder. As midnight neared and the wind settled again into a whisper, Caleb reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. "Not just running now," he said. She squeezed his fingers. "No," she whispered. "Now I'm returning." And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was surviving. No, she felt like she was coming home. The orchard had always been quiet, but now it listened. In the weeks following the fire, the land seemed to absorb everything. Caleb's steady footsteps, Elena's whispered phone calls, the faint click of a keyboard echoing through the cabin at midnight. And beneath it all, the hum of something rising, not fear, purpose. Elena didn't just want justice. She wanted truth to grow, the way the apples did here. Slowly, under patient hands, fed by rain and rooted deep. The orchard, once just Caleb's inheritance, had become their headquarters, their fortress, their ground zero. Each morning, Elena mapped out contact lists, investigative journalists who still remembered what integrity meant, old professors who now ran ethics watchdogs, lawyers who hadn't sold their souls to the highest bidder. Caleb tracked fuel deliveries, coordinated safe drop points, arranged transport routes through backroads only the locals knew. And those locals, they began to show up. First, it was old Mary Devlin, who once worked for a Hawthorne-owned supplier and had been forced into early retirement for asking the wrong questions. Then came Darren Lowe, a trucker who'd lost his contract and nearly his rig after refusing to transport illegal chemicals for a drilling site. They came quietly, in twos and threes, no announcements, no banners, just a nod, a word, a hand on Caleb's shoulder as they handed over flash drives, photos, printed documents folded into weathered envelopes. They didn't just believe Elena, they remembered her. You were the only Hawthorne who looked us in the eye, Mary said, pressing a worn thumb drive into her palm. You stood on the factory floor and asked how we were, not how fast we worked. Elena said nothing, just hugged her, tight. The orchard's back shed became a war room. Maps stretched across walls. Strings connected counties to contracts, pipelines to payoffs. Caleb built a hidden compartment beneath the barn's foundation, reinforced with steel he traded lumber for. It wasn't about fear anymore. It was about readiness. One afternoon, Caleb brought out a folded piece of parchment he'd kept tucked away since his grandfather passed. A survey map of the land, inked with boundaries and notations in looping script. This land has always been more than trees, he said. My grandfather called it soil for second chances. Thought it was just poetic nonsense. Now I see it wasn't. Elena studied the map, eyes lingering on the borders. We can make it that again, she whispered. But for more than just us. That night, she drafted the first bylaws for what would become the Haven Trust, a foundation that would reallocate land seized by Hawthorne Minerals back to displaced communities and environmental recovery zones. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was hiding behind someone else's legacy. Or she was rewriting her own. The next morning, Caleb handed her a ring of old brass keys, some labeled, some not. What are these? She asked. He shrugged. Every lock on the property. Barn, cabin, cellar, tractor, even the one to the old pantry door I keep forgetting to fix. She stared at the keys. Why are you giving me these? Caleb met her gaze, steady and sure. Because you don't just live here, Elena. He paused. You belong here. She didn't speak for a long moment. Her fingers curled slowly around the keys, and when she looked up again, there were tears in her eyes, but also steel in her spine. Then let's show them what this place really is, she said. Not just an orchard. Caleb nodded. A reckoning. The rain returned the night they finalized the drop. It came not as a downpour, but as a steady, deliberate rhythm, tapping against the tin roof, pooling in the corners of the orchard, soaking into the earth like it was washing something away. Inside the cabin, under the golden glow of oil lamps and laptop screens, Elena leaned over a table scattered with papers, flash drives, and sealed envelopes. This was it. Everything she had gathered, bank records, photos of rigging equipment on protected land, wire transfers to offshore accounts, encrypted messages between board members, even a confession audio from a frightened junior executive was now packed, labeled, and addressed. 3 packages, 3 paths, one to the state attorney general, one to a federal environmental task force, one to Veritas Light, a whistleblower-run journalism outfit known for taking down giants. You sure this is all of it? Caleb asked, standing behind her. It's not everything, she replied, sealing the last envelope. But it's enough to start a storm. He nodded slowly. Good, let's flood the bastards. They waited until morning. Then, before the world fully woke, Caleb loaded the packages into the bed of his truck, covered in a tarp. Elena sat beside him, her fingers nervously twisting the locket around her neck. Bushdock. The drive into town was quiet. No one followed them. No black SUVs. No shadows in the rearview mirror. But both of them knew. Once those envelopes left their hands, there would be no going back. At the shipping center, Elena hesitated at the door. Her fingers hovered over the packages like they were living things. You can still walk away, Caleb said gently. I don't want to. And with that, she stepped forward and dropped each parcel into its designated courier bin. 1, 2, 3. Copatire. The clerk barely looked up. Just like that, the future was in motion. Daikin. On the drive back, the rain began to clear. A break in the clouds revealed streaks of gold, sunlight trying to reclaim the sky. But the stillness didn't last. 2 nights later, they came again. This time, Elena had prepared. The orchard perimeter was laced with tripwire alarms. Nothing violent, just loud. Caleb had called in a few favors from neighboring farms. 4 pickup trucks rolled up in silence, loaded not with weapons, but with men and women who had been burned by the Hawthorne Empire one way or another. They didn't wear uniforms, But they were ready. The first motion alarm tripped just past midnight. Elena was already awake, standing at the window of the main house with a burner phone in one hand and a cold resolve in her chest. 5 SUVs. No headlights. Tactical gear. Suppressed rifles. They're not bluffing, Caleb said, peering through binoculars from the upstairs window. Neither are we, she replied, and pressed send on a message routed through encrypted servers. Attack confirmed. Files already dispatched. Cover us. Down at the orchard's south fence, one of the intruders tripped a flare. The orchard lit up in a sudden blaze of orange light. Not fire, but warning. The standoff lasted 20 minutes. The intruders met resistance they didn't expect. Locals who knew every tree, every trench, every inch of elevation. Caleb flanked them with a spotlight mounted to the tractor. Elena, from the shadows of the barn, triggered a sound bomb that scattered the line. When the county sheriff arrived, tipped by the very same attorney general's office now reviewing her documents, the rest of the men tried to flee. 3 were caught, zip-tied with duct tape and thrown into the mud. 2 more were stopped by an old rancher with a shotgun and a steel gaze. Hal to buys, by sunrise, it was over. The orchard was still standing. So was Elena. So was truth. And by the end of that day, the first wave of headlines broke across every major network. Whistleblower claims land fraud at Hawthorne Minerals. Environmental violations tied to political bribery and multi-state scheme. Woman believed dead returns with evidence and scandal worth billions. Elena stood on the porch, hair damp with rain, scar bare under a rising sun, and watched it all unfold on Caleb's old radio. "This is just the beginning," she murmured. Caleb stepped beside her. "Good. We've got a whole orchard full of endings to write." They called it the Orchard Incident on the news. But to the people who lived it, it was a war. Not one fought with bombs and armies, but with silence, courage, land, and the stubborn refusal to be erased. The story went viral within 48 hours. Elena's name, once buried beneath ash and false obituaries, was now everywhere. The media painted her as a rogue heiress, a corporate traitor, a ghost-turned-martyr. But no headline could capture what was actually happening behind the gates of the orchard, because the real battle wasn't just legal, it was personal. Bearers. Vincent Hawthorne, still clinging to control, went into overdrive. His lawyers filed emergency injunctions. He released public statements painting Elena as unstable, emotionally compromised, and, quote, likely manipulated by rural radicals. But the truth was already out, and the orchard had become a symbol. That week, dozens more came. Nassaway. Displaced ranchers. Whistleblowers. Women who had once worked as secretaries for shell companies and finally had proof in hand. A local teacher whose school had been condemned after Hawthorne mining quietly bought the land and left toxic runoff. They arrived with flash drives, old files, and trembling hands. And they were met with open gates. Caleb and Elena didn't host press conferences. They didn't beg for cameras. But people came anyway. Reporters from major outlets, legal observers, environmental groups. Some seeking justice, some seeking spectacle. But no matter their reason, what they found was the same. A farm rebuilding from fire. A woman who refused to flinch. A man who refused to leave. The orchard became something more than a home. It became a front line. When another black SUV approached the gate one afternoon, Caleb stepped out with a wrench in one hand and dirt still on his jeans. The man inside the car rolled down the window. He wore a suit that looked too stiff for these roads. "You're trespassing," Caleb said evenly. "I'm here to offer Ms. Hawthorne a deal. You'll need to speak up. Trees don't negotiate. I represent a group of concerned investors. If she drops this, we'll reinstate her share in the company, clean slate, full payout." Behind Caleb, Elena stepped out of the barn. "No," she said simply. "You haven't even heard the number." "I don't need it." The man's smile faded. "Then you're making a mistake. You're declaring war." Elena nodded. "Then write that down. Put it in your next meeting memo." The SUV turned around, tires spitting gravel, and was gone. Caleb looked at her. "You all right?" "No," she admitted. "But I'm done being afraid." Later that night, She stood before the small crowd that had gathered in the cleared field near the orchard center. People who had fought for their homes, their names, their right to be seen. "I'm not here because I was brave," she said, voice loud against the breeze. "I'm here because I had no choice. Because silence was killing me faster than truth ever could." She held up the locket, the same one she'd once buried behind layers of shame and secrecy. "This held evidence," she said, "but it also held the last piece of who I was before they tried to erase me." She looked around. "I'm done hiding, and you should be too. We didn't lose everything. We are everything, and they're gonna learn that land isn't just power, it's memory, and it's ours." The crowd roared, not with fists, but with tears and hope. And somewhere, beneath the orchard's roots, something shifted. Not just survival, not just revenge, but restoration. And for the first time since the fire, Caleb reached for Elena's hand in front of everyone. She didn't flinch. The war had begun. But they weren't fighting alone. The courthouse was quieter than the orchard. Sterile, cold, built of marble and old secrets. But when Elena stepped through its glass doors, scar bare beneath the courthouse lighting, she didn't carry silence anymore. She carried truth. The hearing had been expedited. With public pressure mounting and state officials scrambling for cover, the judiciary could no longer ignore the allegations. Vincent Hawthorne had been detained at a private airstrip just outside Denver, caught attempting to flee with 3 passports, a briefcase of burner phones, and a laptop that mysteriously malfunctioned. Elena stood in the hallway, waiting, not as a ghost, not as a victim, as a witness, as a survivor, reclaiming her name on her terms. When the elevator doors opened, Vincent emerged in cuffs, flanked by 2 federal agents. His tailored suit was wrinkled, hair disheveled, but the arrogance in his eyes was still there. That part hadn't burned with the house. He saw her, and faltered. "Lena," he scoffed, recovering quickly. "Didn't think you had the spine to come here." She didn't blink. "And I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to leave a paper trail. But here we are." He laughed, dry and bitter. "You really think they'll love you for this? You turned on your own family." "I turned away from rot," she said evenly. "That's not betrayal, that's survival." Vincent stepped closer, but the agents didn't let him get far. "You think this little farm rebellion will last?" he hissed. "You're nothing without the name." She took a step forward, scar in full view. "That's where you're wrong, Vincent. The name didn't make me strong. What I had to survive because of it did." The agents led him away, and she didn't watch him go. Instead, she turned toward the courtroom, toward the press, toward the world that had once written her off as dead. Inside, she testified. Not with fire, with clarity. She laid out how Vincent funneled millions through shell companies, illegally seized protected lands, and ordered the cover-up of an environmental disaster that had displaced hundreds. She presented emails, voice recordings, internal memos, names, signatures, no embellishments, no theatrics, just facts and the calm weight of someone who had nothing left to lose but everything to rebuild. When the session ended, she stepped into the sun outside the courthouse. A few reporters shouted questions. A woman in the crowd held a hand over her heart. A man in work boots tipped his hat as she passed. And at the bottom of the courthouse steps stood Caleb. No suit, no pretense, just the same worn flannel and the steady kind of presence you could build a life on. He didn't speak. She just walked into his arms. "You did it," he murmured. She closed her eyes. "We did." They stood like that for a long time, the world swirling around them. Because the truth was this: she hadn't reclaimed the Hawthorne name to wear it. She'd reclaimed it to bury what it stood for and plant something better in its place. Months passed and the orchard breathed again. Where ashes once clung to the soil, green returned, not just from the trees but from the people. Dust was replaced with laughter, broken boards with hammer strikes and shared meals, and silence with the hush of healing. Elena never moved back into the Hawthorne estate. Not for a visit, not for closure. The mansion could rot beneath its marble in shame. Her home was here, where second chances grew. Caleb repaired the barn with his own hands. Beams lifted one by one, with the help of neighbors and new friends. Elena used her regained legal standing and the vast Hawthorne inheritance Vincent had failed to shield to create something radical. The Haven Trust was born. She quietly transferred hundreds of acres of misappropriated land, once stolen under her family's name, into the trust. Parcels became community farms, protected groves, sanctuaries, refuge, and at the center of it all stood the orchard. It became a place for the forgotten, women fleeing violence, farmers bankrupted by crooked contracts, kids who had lived in cars or shelters, now learning how to plant things that lived. The main house held a legal aid office and a small schoolroom where a former professor taught classes under strings of fairy lights. Elena offered workshops on how to read a contract, how to stand up in court, how to untangle identity from the wreckage of a last name, Pomozakor Abichan. No one paid, no one owed. They simply helped the next. Caleb taught the boys how to fix fences, change oil, and train horses with patience instead of force. He never sought credit, just handed out tools and nodded when someone learned something new. Some nights, they gathered by the fire pit behind the barn, trading stories and songs under starlight. Others, they sat in silence, grieving, remembering, healing. One evening, as the air turned crisp and apples ripened deep red, Elena stood beside a young girl staring at the scar on her cheek. "Does it still hurt?" the girl asked. Elena knelt. "Sometimes, but not the way it used to." "Do you wish it wasn't there?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said, "because without it, I might forget what I survived." The girl nodded slowly, then reached out and touched her own cheek, freckled and round. "Okay," she said. "Then I'll stop hiding mine too." And with that, she ran off to join the others by the horses. Elena stood quietly, heart full in a way that had nothing to do with justice or headlines. This was peace. Not perfect, not painless, but earned. That night, as she walked the rows of trees with Caleb, the sky overhead deep with stars, she asked, "Did you ever think it would look like this?" He shook his head, smiling gently. "No, but I always hoped something good would grow here. I just never guessed it'd be you." She smiled, taking his hand. "I didn't grow," she said. "I replanted." The mornings of the orchard came slow and golden now. Sunlight filtered through the apple trees like honey, and the wind carried more than dust. It carried laughter. Children's voices echoed from the schoolhouse at the edge of the field. Horses snorted softly in the stables. Somewhere, someone was fixing a gate, humming a tune off-key. Elena stood outside the barn, rolling up the sleeves of her flannel shirt, her scar catching the early light. She didn't cover it anymore. Not with scarves, not with hair, not with shame. Mana barn, marn, na barn, because now when people looked at her, they didn't see a victim. Mar na barn, marn, na barn, na barn, mar na barn, marn na barn, marn na barn, marn, 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 a survivor. The scar wasn't erased. It had been rewritten. Across the orchard, Caleb leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, watching her the way he always did, not as a man who wanted to possess something beautiful, but as one who respected it. He had never once asked her to hide the pain, never winced at the past, never treated her like something broken. And in that quiet steadiness, she had bloomed. Later that afternoon, a group of children, barefoot, wild-haired, and grinning, gathered for riding lessons. Elena helped one of the youngest, a shy boy with bruises he didn't talk about, onto the saddle of a calm old mare named Violet. "What if I fall?" the boy whispered. She adjusted the stirrup and looked him in the eye. "Then we get back up. That's what we do here." He nodded, and when Violet began her slow walk across the pasture, his smile was small but real. At the edge of the orchard, a new wooden sign stood tall and weathered. "Blossom Hill Refuge, where scars fade and souls begin again." Below that, carved in smaller letters only the clothes would notice. Founded by two survivors who chose to love louder than fear. That night, After dinner was shared and lanterns lit, Elena sat beside Caleb on the porch. The sky stretched wide above them, clear, eternal, full of stars. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" she asked softly. Caleb leaned back in his chair, eyes on the stars. "Sometimes. And I wouldn't have known what I was missing. But I'd still have felt the hole." She was quiet for a moment, then turned to him. "I think I was always meant to end up here. I just had to get lost enough to find it." He looked at her, scar, soul, and all, and smiled. "Funny thing about scars," he said. "They never go away. But they change, just like we do." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I used to hate mine," she whispered. "And now? Now it reminds me that I survived." He pulled her gently to his shoulder. "And that you still can," he said. And in the quiet hush of the orchard, beneath the stars and the wind and the soft rustle of trees, Elena Hawthorne, now simply Elena, closed her eyes and felt whole. Spring came early that year. The orchard, reborn from soot and silence, exploded into life, petals falling like snow, bees weaving golden threads through the air, and trees heavy with promise. Every step between the rows felt like walking through a cathedral made of light and scent and second chances. Elena stood at the heart of it all, barefoot in the grass, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's baking. She wore no makeup, no name tag, no designer scarf. Just the orchard breeze in her hair and peace in her chest. Caleb found her near the southern edge, where the oldest apple tree stood tall, gnarled, beautiful, scarred like them both. He had a small velvet pouch in his shirt pocket, worn at the corners from years of holding onto something he'd never been sure he'd give away. Now he was sure. He walked up behind her, clearing his throat just enough for her to hear. "You busy?" She smiled without turning. "Always." He chuckled, stepping beside her. "Mind if I interrupt forever?" She turned, eyebrows raised. That's a strange thing to say before noon, but his eyes were serious, soft. The kind of look that could melt stone and fear and every jagged edge she still carried. From his pocket, he pulled out the pouch and opened it slowly. Beul. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, set with a small turquoise stone, smoothed by time but still brilliant. It wasn't new, it wasn't grand, but it had the kind of soul only years could give. "It was my mama's," he said quietly. "My dad gave it to her when they had nothing but this land and a pair of calloused hands. She wore it until the day she passed. Always said the land brought them together and it would bring love again." Elena didn't speak. He stepped closer, took her hand, still streaked with flour, fingers calloused from work, strong and warm. "I don't have much," he said. "Never did, but I've got this. And I've got you." He slid the ring onto her finger. "I don't need a church," he murmured. "Don't need a crowd, just land, sky, and you saying yes." Elena looked down at the ring, then up at him. This man who had never once asked her to change, never once recoiled from her scars, never once backed down from standing beside her even when bullets and headlines flew. She smiled. A real smile, wide, unhidden, rooted deep. "Yes," she said. And in that moment, beneath the canopy of blooming apple trees, the world went quiet and still and right. Nacha, nacha, nacha. They didn't kiss for show. Didn't shout or cheer. They just held each other. Nacha. Because this wasn't a beginning built on escape. Nacha. It was one built on choice. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.